When Jonathan Roumie, the man who portrays Jesus in The Chosen, was casually invited to sing at an exclusive Hollywood gathering, everyone expected a simple, pleasant performance to entertain the crowd. What they didn't realize was that Jonathan had been guarding a devastatingly powerful song for over a decade. A song born from the most soul-crushing night of his life, when he stood on a bridge at 3 a.m., screaming at God and ready to abandon his faith forever. Hidden within the lyrics was a secret so raw and personal that only one dying priest had ever heard it, and Jonathan had sworn he would never sing it publicly. But when he stepped up to that microphone in front of 400 influential entertainment executives, something inside him broke open. What poured out wasn't just a song. It was a confession that would shatter every heart in that room and leave Hollywood's most hardened power players sobbing uncontrollably. This wasn't supposed to be a life-changing moment. It was supposed to be fun. But what Jonathan revealed that night through his music would expose the hidden spiritual hunger of an entire industry and prove that sometimes the most sacred moments happen when you least expect them. The song he sang contained 3 words that would haunt everyone who heard them, and by the end of the story, you'll understand why those same 3 words have the power to change your life too. This wasn't meant to be anything more than light entertainment at a sophisticated Beverly Hills networking event. The Crystal Ballroom was filled with A-list producers, studio executives, and entertainment moguls who had carefully built their careers, keeping personal faith completely separate from their professional lives. These were people who controlled billion-dollar franchises and shaped global culture. Yet most had spent decades avoiding anything that felt too spiritual or emotionally vulnerable in their business circles. The evening was designed for polished conversations, strategic connections, and the kind of surface-level charm that defined Hollywood social events. Religious discussions were typically off-limits, not out of hostility, but because they felt too personal, too risky for an industry built on image management. Most attendees had learned to keep their deepest questions and spiritual struggles locked away, hidden behind professional masks that never slipped in public. The last thing anyone expected was for their carefully constructed emotional walls to come crashing down during what was supposed to be a casual moment of entertainment. But Jonathan Roumie was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful spiritual experiences happen not in churches or sacred spaces, but in rooms full of people who have forgotten how to be vulnerable with each other. Before we reveal the 3 haunting words that Jonathan sang, and why they left 400 of Hollywood's most powerful people in tears, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what brought you to this story. If you love moments where unexpected vulnerability breaks through professional barriers and touches the deepest parts of the human heart, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we're sharing another incredible story about a celebrity who shocked everyone with a hidden truth that changed lives forever. And you absolutely must watch until the very end of this video, because what Jonathan did immediately after his performance was even more surprising than the song itself. His response to the overwhelming reaction revealed a side of him that nobody saw coming. And it's the reason this story is still talked about in Hollywood circles today. The aftermath of that single song created a ripple effect that transformed not just individual lives, but actually changed how the entertainment industry approaches faith-based content forever. Trust me, the ending will give you chills and show you why sometimes the most ordinary moments become the most extraordinary turning points in our lives. So stay with us as we dive into the moment that turned a simple request to sing into a spiritual awakening that nobody in that room will ever forget. The evening had been flowing smoothly, with typical Hollywood networking, when the event's charming host, David Richardson, noticed Jonathan sitting quietly at his table near the back of the ballroom. David, a well-connected producer, known for his warm personality and ability to bring people together, had been looking for ways to add some spontaneous entertainment to the evening. He approached Jonathan with a genuine smile and that easy confidence that made him so popular in industry circles. "Hey Jonathan, I know you're incredibly talented beyond just acting. David said, his voice carrying across nearby tables. "Would you mind sharing a song with everyone? Nothing formal, just something to add a little music to our evening." The request was innocent enough, the kind of casual ask that happened at these gatherings when someone discovered a hidden talent among the guests. The crowd around them began to take notice, conversations pausing as people realized something was happening. There was no mockery, no challenge, just genuine curiosity and anticipation for what they assumed would be a pleasant surprise. Jonathan felt his chest tighten as friendly faces turned toward him expectantly. His manager, seated nearby, gave him an encouraging nod, thinking this could be a lovely, low-pressure way for Jonathan to showcase another dimension of his artistry. But what nobody in that room understood was that Jonathan wasn't just being asked to sing. He was being asked to choose between safety and truth, between hiding his deepest pain and finally letting the world see the broken places that had shaped his faith. To understand what happened next, we need to go back 12 years to a moment that nearly destroyed Jonathan's faith and changed the trajectory of his entire life forever. Jonathan was a struggling actor in New York City, completely unknown and desperately broke, living in a cramped studio apartment in Queens that he could barely afford even with 3 roommates. His world had just collapsed in the most devastating way possible. His beloved father, Michael Roumie, had died suddenly from a massive heart attack at only 52 years old, leaving behind crushing medical bills that threatened to bankrupt his entire family. The man who had taught Jonathan to pray, who had driven him to every audition as a teenager, who had believed in his dreams when nobody else did, was gone without warning, without goodbye, without any chance for Jonathan to say the words that now haunted his sleepless nights. Jonathan had been rejected from 89 auditions in a row over the course of 8 brutal months, each no feeling like another confirmation that his dreams were foolish and his prayers were falling on deaf ears. The rejection letters piled up on his tiny desk, like evidence of his failure, and every morning brought new reminders that he was running out of money, running out of hope, and running out of reasons to keep believing that God had any plan for his life whatsoever. His long-term girlfriend Sarah, who had supported him through 2 years of struggle, had finally reached her breaking point and left him for Marcus, a successful investment banker who could offer her the stability and security that Jonathan's faith-based dreams never could. "I can't watch you destroy yourself chasing something that's never going to happen," she had said as she packed her things, her words cutting deeper than any casting director's rejection. His landlord, Mr. Peterson, was threatening eviction within 10 days, and Jonathan had exactly $247 in his bank account, not even enough to cover a security deposit somewhere else. But the worst part wasn't the external circumstances crashing down around him. It was the deafening, suffocating silence he felt whenever he tried to pray, as if heaven itself had abandoned him precisely when he needed it most desperately. It was 2:47 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday night in February when Jonathan found himself standing alone on the Brooklyn Bridge, his breath visible in the bitter cold, not contemplating suicide, but screaming questions at God that had been building up inside him for months, like pressure in a volcano ready to explode. "Where are you when I need you most?" he shouted into the wind, his voice cracking with years of suppressed anger, disappointment, and devastating loneliness. "I've done everything you asked. I've tried to live right. I've prayed every day. I've trusted your plan even when it made no sense. And this is what I get. Silence? Abandonment? My father is dead. My dreams are dying, and you won't even give me a sign that you're listening." The tears froze on his cheeks as he pounded his fists against the bridge's railing, his knuckles splitting and bleeding in the cold. That's when he encountered Father Miguel Santos, an elderly Puerto Rican priest with kind eyes and calloused hands, who was walking across the bridge at that impossible hour for reasons Jonathan would never fully understand. Most people would have crossed the street to avoid an angry man yelling at the sky, but Father Miguel approached him calmly as if he'd been expecting this exact encounter. "Sounds like you're having an important conversation with God," the priest said gently, his accent warm despite the freezing air. "How's it going?" Jonathan broke down completely, pouring out years of frustration, doubt, and pain to this stranger who listened without judgment, without trying to fix anything, without offering the religious platitudes that had become meaningless to Jonathan's hurting heart. Instead of offering easy answers or scripture verses, Father Miguel shared something that shook Jonathan to his core. "I've been a priest for 43 years, and I've questioned God's existence every single day. I've stood at hospital bedsides watching children die, and wondered if I've wasted my entire life believing in fairy tales. I've buried young mothers and held fathers as they cursed heaven, and I've felt that same terrible silence you're describing right now." Jonathan stared at him in disbelief, expecting some kind of religious correction or explanation, but Father Miguel continued, "But I've learned something that might help you tonight. Faith isn't about having certainty or getting answers to our questions. Faith is about having the courage to keep asking the questions that terrify you most, even when heaven feels empty, even when God feels absent, even when everything inside you wants to stop believing altogether." 3 nights later, alone in Father Miguel's tiny church at midnight, with nothing but flickering candles for light, Jonathan sat in the front pew, with tears streaming down his face, and began writing words that seemed to pour out of his soul like blood from a wound. It wasn't a hymn or a worship song. It was a raw, honest confession about feeling abandoned by heaven, but somehow, mysteriously, finding a strange hope in that very abandonment. He wrote about the courage it takes to keep praying when your prayers feel like they're bouncing off the ceiling, about the faith required to keep believing in love when love has broken your heart, about the strength needed to keep trusting God when God feels like a cruel stranger. The song he called "When Heaven Goes Silent" became his most private possession, more intimate than a diary, more sacred than any prayer he'd ever memorized. Father Miguel was the only person who ever heard it, and when the old priest died 2 years later from pancreatic cancer, his final words to Jonathan were a prophecy that would come true in that Beverly Hills ballroom. "Promise me something, mijo. Someday, when you're surrounded by people who think faith means having all the answers, sing them your questions instead. That's where God lives, not in the certainty, but in the courage to keep asking when you're afraid of what you might discover." Standing at that microphone, Jonathan felt the weight of Father Miguel's dying words pressing against his chest like a physical force. The friendly expectation in the room suddenly felt overwhelming as he realized this wasn't just about entertaining a crowd. This was the moment the old priest had prophesied years ago. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his phone, scrolling past hundreds of contacts and notes until he found it buried deep in his folders. The song he'd written in that empty church at midnight, titled "When Heaven Goes Silent." The lyrics he'd read countless times, but never spoken aloud to another living soul, stared back at him from the screen. For a moment, the elegant ballroom faded away, and he was back in that tiny Brooklyn church, pouring his broken heart onto paper, while tears fell onto the pages. "This song," Jonathan began, his voice quieter than anyone expected, but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent room, "isn't about having faith. It's about what happens when faith feels impossible, but you keep reaching toward heaven anyway." The atmosphere shifted dramatically. People had expected something uplifting or familiar, but Jonathan's introduction promised something far more vulnerable and real. He closed his eyes for just a moment, and those watching closely could see his lips moving in what looked like a silent conversation with someone unseen. When he opened his eyes again, there was a depth there that made even the most emotionally guarded people in that room suddenly understand they were about to witness something sacred. Without any musical accompaniment, Jonathan began to sing a cappella, his voice raw and unpolished in the most beautiful way imaginable. The song started as barely more than a whisper, words about crying out to an empty sky and hearing only silence in return. But instead of despair, there was something else threading through his voice. A broken hope that made everyone lean forward without realizing it. As he sang about standing in that church, screaming questions at the ceiling, and getting no answers back, his voice cracked on the word abandoned. And instead of embarrassment, it felt like the most honest sound anyone in that room had heard in years. The bridge of the song was where everything changed. Jonathan's voice grew stronger as he sang about learning to find God, not in the voice that speaks back, but in the courage to keep calling out, even when heaven feels empty. Tears began appearing on faces throughout the ballroom, not just from people of faith, but from confirmed atheists and spiritual skeptics who suddenly recognized their own midnight questions in Jonathan's lyrics. The final verse dropped to barely above a whisper, yet somehow it carried to every soul in that massive space as he sang the three words that would haunt everyone present. I'm still here. Those simple words, repeated like a prayer, like a declaration, like a promise to an absent God, contained every ounce of defiant hope that Jonathan had discovered in his darkest hour. When the last note faded into complete silence, Jonathan didn't bow or smile. He simply whispered thank you and stepped back, leaving behind a room full of people who had just been fundamentally changed by 3 minutes of absolute honesty. For what felt like an eternity, but was only 10 seconds, 400 of Hollywood's most influential people sat in complete, stunned silence, processing what they had just experienced. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe as the weight of Jonathan's vulnerability hung in the air like something sacred and untouchable. Then, from the far corner of the ballroom, a single person began to clap. Rebecca Chen, a notoriously tough studio executive known for her atheism and her reputation for keeping emotions completely out of business decisions. The applause that followed wasn't the polite appreciation of charity events or the manufactured enthusiasm of award shows, but something deeper and more reverent, as if people weren't celebrating a performance, but acknowledging a moment of truth that had somehow happened in the last place anyone expected it. Grown men who hadn't shown emotion in decades of cutthroat business deals were wiping their eyes openly, no longer caring about maintaining their professional facades. Women who had built entire careers on cynicism and strategic thinking found themselves sobbing quietly, their carefully constructed walls crumbling in the face of such raw authenticity. But what happened next was even more extraordinary than the tears. Instead of the typical networking chatter resuming, people began staying, talking, sharing parts of themselves they had kept hidden for years. Studio executives were having conversations about their own spiritual struggles with writers and directors they'd known professionally for decades, but had never really talked to about anything personal or meaningful. David Richardson, the host who had made the innocent request for Jonathan to sing, approached him with tears still visible in his eyes and said something that would become legendary in Hollywood circles. I asked for entertainment, and you gave us healing instead. Rebecca Chen, the executive who had started the applause, waited until the crowd thinned before approaching Jonathan with words that surprised even her. I've spent 20 years building walls against anything that resembled faith or vulnerability. In 3 minutes, you didn't tear them down. You showed me that maybe the cracks I've been trying to hide are actually windows to something beautiful. What Jonathan did next shocked everyone even more than his performance. Instead of networking or capitalizing on the moment, he began quietly moving through the room, not promoting himself or his career, but simply listening to people share their own stories of doubt, struggle, and hidden spiritual questions. He exchanged phone numbers not with agents or producers, but with people who whispered to him about their own midnight moments of feeling abandoned by heaven. The ripple effects of that single song began immediately and continue to this day. Hollywood now hosts regular gatherings where industry professionals can discuss faith and doubt openly. Studios actively seek authentic spiritual content instead of avoiding it. And in a small Brooklyn church, there's now a plaque dedicated to Father Miguel that reads, He taught us that God lives in the questions we're brave enough to ask out loud. So here's our question for you. What song are you carrying in your heart that you're afraid to sing? What 3 words of truth are you holding back because you think the world isn't ready to hear them? Jonathan's courage to share his deepest questions instead of his polished answers didn't just move a room full of Hollywood executives. It reminded all of us that our most broken moments often contain our most beautiful truths. Maybe you have your own midnight song, your own moment when heaven felt silent, your own story of finding hope in the questions rather than the answers. We want to hear about it in the comments below. Tell us about a time when vulnerability led to unexpected connection, or share what this story means to your own journey of faith and doubt. If stories like this move you, where real people choose authenticity over perfection and discover that their deepest struggles can become their greatest gifts to others, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're constantly exploring these incredible moments when ordinary people do extraordinary things simply by being brave enough to tell the truth. Tomorrow, we have another story that will absolutely blow you away about a celebrity who shocked the world not with scandal, but with a hidden act of kindness that no one was supposed to know about. And you won't believe how it changed everything. But before you go, remember this. Sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is admit you don't have it all figured out. Sometimes the most honest prayer is simply saying, "I'm still here." And sometimes that raw, imperfect honesty is exactly what a broken world needs to hear. Your midnight questions might just be someone else's morning hope, so don't be afraid to let them hear your song.